Hello and welcome. My name is Chetan Walia. I'm the co-author and presenter for Indeterminable Responsibility, Determinable Harm, From Organized Irresponsibility to Harmless Value Creation. This is a paper presented at British Academy of Management 2020 Conference in the Cloud. There are health defects associated with manufacturing and distribution of products such as tobacco, cars, alcohol, and the health defects associated with the companies which are responsible for manufacturing and distributing them have largely been referred to as industrial epidemics. Now, companies such as Coca-Cola, Diageo, Kraft, who are the leading market leaders, have been documented to produce products that are the leading cause of death and disease, particularly the non-communicable diseases or the NCDs. NCDs accounted for 63% of 57 million global deaths in 2008. Not only that, strategically, these companies tend to use hard power, which is their financial clout, and soft power, which is influencing ideas through advocates or scientists or even academics, to shift legislation and regulation in their favor. And intentionally or unintentionally, these firms justify these acts in the name of organization viability. And that leads us to organized irresponsibility, largely from the criminology literature. Organized irresponsibility is defined as a relationship between agents, individuals, organizations, or even nation states, where actions of the agents generate risks and damages for others. However, because of the presence of multitude of agents, they're able to avoid culpability or even responsibility because of the complications that are present in tracing the harm specifically to the agent's action. Now, large organizations particularly have been known to benefit from this indeterminism because they produce social risk, they accrue profits from those risks, and they disproportionately avoid the consequences. Society as a whole may be worse off. For instance, damages from the global financial crisis, worsening climate change, plastic waste crisis are very concrete examples where the benefits to the corporations producing all of this have been very large, and the punishment that have been, or even the selective punishments that have been imposed on them, are very small in comparison to the profits that these firms were able to accrue. Now, this suggests that the harm or injury caused is determinable. However, no agent can be held responsible because the responsibility itself remains indeterminable. And that is a picture, essentially a characteristic of capitalism itself. Studies in psychology show us that capitalism is dominated by a winner-take-all mindset. For example, the richest 1% of Americans own 40% of the country's wealth, so there's an inequality persistent. And the studies go on to suggest that capitalism encourages the whole concept of responsibility to the self. That is, it encourages maximization of self-interest, and that becomes a route to fulfilling responsibilities to others by the way of taxes or whatever social initiatives that agencies can run. There have been advantages of capitalism, particularly technological advances or medical advances, and because of the ability of capitalism to successfully organize the economic activity, it leads many a time scholars and researchers to conclude that there in fact is no alternative, which is also called the Tina mindset. Now, there are three concerns emerge from studying this literature. The first is that there seems to be an opposing interest. Studies in psychology very clearly suggest that benevolence, universalism, self-direction are psychologically opposed to the capitalist predominant goals of achievement and need for power. The second concern that emerges is that there seems to be a lack of compassion. Now, scholars have noted that members with firms who have the most resources at their disposal to act with compassion are actually the ones who are the least likely to do so. And then the criminology literature suggests that there is an increasing number of agents. The OI principle states that the increasing number of legal agents further increases this complexity of attributing responsibility because the generation of social harm occurs, but because of a multitude of agents, the attributable nature of that responsibility remains elusive. And what is responsibility? In very simple terms, responsibility means obviously being responsible for one's actions that may cause harm or injury to others. Responsibility focuses on the act or task and not on accounting for that task. That is, responsibility differs from accountability or to be called into account. The legal literature suggests that if there is no responsibility, there in fact can be no law, and the criminology literature equates responsibility to culpability. Essentially, how we have come to understand responsibility is like a narration of a simple question: who is responsible? And on the other hand of it lies the indeterminism of responsibility. But before we get into defining what indeterminable responsibility may be, it may be important to understand how we understand indeterminism itself. Now, the world can be, in a very physical science view, the world can be divided into something that is uncertain and something that is certain. Uncertain, on the other hand, is the unknown, so there is no way to define it. So we can only deal with something that is somewhat visible under the realm of certainty. Certainty has again been divided into perfect and imperfect. Perfect is something which we might have complete information of, and imperfect is something which might be incomplete information about a phenomenon, act, or a physical thing. And the imperfect or the incomplete uncertainty has been divided into subjective risk and objective risk. Subjective risk is based on ignorance, and objective risk is based where the risk is evident and can be calculated factual. Now, it is the subjective risk or the incomplete information which we largely understand as an uncertain environment or an indeterminable environment because we don't have enough information about it. And when we combine indeterminism and we combine responsibility to understand what indeterminable responsibility is, then indeterminable responsibility occurs when an agent, individual or organization within a network of other agents causes suffering or harm to others in society, but the reasons for suffering are attributed and distributed systemically between varying agencies, and suffering then becomes an independent problem to solve. So this can be understood with the example of NCDs that we were taking. It's been produced by certain agents, by the products and acts of certain agents, but the suffering caused, that is the disease itself, has now become an independent problem to solve, much like the realms of chaos theory, where now you can't trace the effect to the cause essentially, and that is what we are referring to or suggesting to be called as indeterminable responsibility. While it's similar to the principle of organized irresponsibility, there are three major differences that we would like to point attention to. The indeterminable responsibility does not deal with the who. It does not deal with the question essentially who is responsible. On the other side, it's asking a question what is responsible, and therefore it is suggesting the use of products as a unit of analysis rather than the individual or the agency that the traditional definitions of responsibility seem to be relying on. And that brings us to the question of the what and not the who. You see, the law is concerned with the who. The understanding of responsibility is largely derived from the question who is responsible, and this understanding seems to have spilled over strategic management and policy making and other areas as well. Understanding of responsibility derived from who is responsible, but if for a moment we are able to shift that lens to what is responsible, that is from the agent or the agency or the individual or the organization to the product, then responsibility suddenly becomes attributable, it becomes determinable, it's no longer indeterminable. When we deal with the question who and principles of organized irresponsibility operating there, that who question has remained unanswered. But if we shift the lens to the what, the question, for example, in the case of NCD, if we ask what is responsible, the harm has already been attributed to the product and it becomes quite evident. And that leads us to a concept that we are proposing here, which is harmless value creation, which basically is that there have been concepts suggested in recent management literature, such as shared value creation, for example, fairly popular. Shared value creation has called upon managements to explore widening of their horizon, so to say, to create multiplicity of stakeholders and spread value and divide it between many stakeholders. And that further compounds the problem of organized irresponsibility, because if there are many stakeholders, the responsibility is still unattributable. So shared value creation or social expansion models are not really sustainable if one is to study it in context of the UN goals. It's not sustainable because it hasn't addressed the fundamental question, which is, are the products harmless in the first place? For example, a recent study on shared value creation suggested names of companies such as Nestle and Coca-Cola to be creating very successful models of shared value creation. However, one cannot ignore the report that the same two companies have been named in a recent UN report to be propagating or to be the leading causes of non-communicable diseases. So it's all well to say that we can create shared value and expand value creation, but who will answer the fundamental question as to is the product harmless in the first place? And that is harmless value creation. Harmless value creation is the creation of products and services that do not negatively or adversely harm any stakeholder, including the environment. And that's, we saying, is a fundamental threshold requirement, because legal responsibilities in the hierarchy of responsibilities rank higher than economic responsibilities. And strategists, scholars, policymakers need to be cognizant of the fact that causing harm or injury, knowingly or unknowingly, is a legal offense in most legislations. Using practical knowledge to create harmless value creation and realizing that at the same time the same knowledge can create the opposite may not only be a wise thing to do, it's also a very practical thing to do, and it's also a great service to the world. Because legally and morally, society has a right to access products that are harmless in value. And this argument that it may come at an economic cost or it threatens an organization's viability is a weak argument. That there is no alternative to these things is also a weak argument, because if the products are creating a societal cost by the suffering and injury and by spreading of disease and death, then is it really economically viable in the first place? So harmless value creation, we are suggesting that it's not like a right thing or a good thing to do. It must be a threshold requirement. Society's problems are not for businesses to solve. We accept that. But a basic understanding of responsibility, or a basic understanding or shifting the lens of responsibility from who to the what, can help businesses in now at least stopping to create or perpetuating or going on persisting with products that are fundamentally harmful. Strategic management can take notice that harmless value creation may well be a future profitable strategy, because it adds differentiation and it also adds sustainability to whatever an organization's goals are. And policymakers should take cognizance of the fact that turning a blind eye to harmless creation is not a tenable solution, because inaction is also a very conscious decision. And finally, the urgency of the concept of harmless value creation can be demonstrated that in this time and age, we are still talking about the need to add the word harmless to the word creation itself. And there can be no further argument as to why firms and policies and strategy makers need to shift attention to harmless value creation, move away from the organized irresponsibility, and change the lens from the who to the what, because the harm is determinable, and if harm is determinable, harmless is an achievable goal. Thank you for watching. You can leave your comments or any questions that you may have at the bottom of this video. We shall be very happy to take them and answer them. Thank you.